Welcome to the Exponentially Me podcast. Have you ever wondered if we can work better, if we get along better, and if leaders can really influence that? In this podcast, these are some of the questions we will be answering. We'll be talking to some amazing people from all around the world, not just thinkers on this, but the doers, giving you practical information that can make you a better colleague and even a better leader. Hi, I'm Exin, and if a leader takes us where we want to go, does a great leader take us where we ought to be? And not necessarily where we would like to go. Today, I'm speaking to Cynthia Bryant. She has worked in federal agencies for the last 20 years and has led mediations to resolve workplace conflicts and even been part of advising bodies to the president, specifically on diversity and inclusion. She served on multiple boards, amongst others the University of Kansas Law School and the Seeing Guide Dog School. Incidentally, that is especially close to her heart as she uses a guide dog herself. We begin by talking about her experiences with President Jimmy Carter, before moving on to broader topics about how disability knows no race or color or gender. She gives incredible insights into the difficulties of segregation and the search for solutions that help people move forward. We then talk about the best qualities of a leader, how to engage with people and deal with their assumptions. We close by discussing why we need to take a moment just to shut our eyes and listen, and that sometimes we can actually see better with our eyes closed. I do hope you enjoy listening to Cynthia as much as I've loved talking to her. You've had an interesting career, and I've seen your fair share of interesting people, I think. What would you say was the person you admired most?
When I was building my career and getting into mediation and negotiation, I had to do an internship, and one of the people that I interned with, or one of the people I interviewed at the time, was President Jimmy Carter. And I wanted to find out about being savvy and how one works in negotiating. So I was able to go down to, through family friends, I was able to go down to Plains, Georgia, and actually interview him and his wife, Mrs. Carter. And the reason I was so taken with him is his commitment to essentially whatever he started. He became he became extremely focused in what he did, and he completed it. And when I was talking to him about Camp David, and he was telling me about the negotiation, and he kept on going, and no matter where there was some type of block, he persevered. And it's that perseverance about the individual that I greatly admire. Perseverance, resilience. Where there's a will, there's always a way, and I saw that in President Carter. It was an extremely fascinating interview. He's also a very spiritual individual, so his connection with spirituality in his church is his faith can't be shaken. So he's quite a rock, and I admire that.
How did that influence you?
It influenced me in the sense that if adversity comes your way, you keep on pushing through. You keep on finding a way. And just in watching him and understanding coming out of office, starting from ground zero, he persevered. And the influence for me was his excitement about what he did, and my excitement about mediation, my excitement about working with people, and that your dreams can be realized. And I think that he really kick-started that for me again, very much so. He just kick-started that whole idea of don't give up on what you want to do.
We're talking about a man that's quite admired and has a huge influence on the way that we today view things like negotiation. And there's a lot of things that he's taught the world about that. I have a big chunk of respect for him. But not necessarily looking at him only. What would you say leadership means to you?
Leadership, in my opinion, is the ability to not only see the big picture, but also leadership is to bring in others and not stand in the way of their progress. A great leader is never afraid to let others shine. And what I mean by that is, when we think back on the way that corporations, and in the old days, you come to an organization, you come to a corporation, and there's a company line, and you follow the company line, and there's one way to do something. But in today's society, leaders have to not just hold a company line. It is not just the process, it's the people. And we've moved into an age where we're all converging in the workplace. We're converging in terms of generations, in terms of social and racial and ethnic groups. And a true leader has to recognize those types of things. I think a true leader has to be able to step back and do that self-evaluation, that self-assessment of them, to be able to be grounded in who they are, understand their biases, understand themselves, and then in doing so, bring that into understanding others. There has to be a greater openness as a leader than there used to be in the past. It's a demand today. And in being able to do that, we're able to embrace more of the different groups of individuals that I mentioned earlier, gender, societal, racial, color, disability, all of those types of things. If you do not understand yourself first, then you cannot open yourself to understanding others.
Do you also think that is the core of relationships?
Oh, most definitely. A part of relationship building is the ability to make that self-assessment. And, I think that a part of that is an ability to be, to exercise, and I've been doing this in some of the trainings I've been doing lately, to exercise empathy. Empathy doesn't mean doesn't mean pity, it doesn't mean sympathy, it means I'm able to step back and take myself out of the picture and see who you are. And when I do that, I begin to understand how I can relate to you. And this is, to me, a vital part of working with people with disabilities. The thing that I would say about people when you're working with people with disabilities specifically is that I think it's forgotten that we cross all spectrums. I'm a person who is blind, and we cross all spectrums. Disability knows no race, no color, no gender, none of those things. So we are, as a people, trying to establish networks, trying to relationship build across all of these spectrums. And, I can go and I can be in an organization that is predominantly one culture, I still have to deal with disability for that particular culture or societal group.
Mm.
And I can go to a different one. There's still going to be dealing with that, dealing with disability as it relates to that group of people. So disability has no boundaries. It's not classified into one group of people. We're across the spectrum, and a leader has to be able to have that openness and that realization of how broad that is.
So could we say that leadership is a type of relationship?
It is. It's an ongoing relationship. It's a relationship that has to be continually assessed and reassessed and built and rebuilt and reflected upon. The bumps and bruises. How do you recover from those all of those things that occur? It's not just an awareness of yourself, but also how do you handle conflict when it arises? It's many components based on relationships, but yes, it is relationship building.
Do you think relationships can help us combat discrimination?
I do. What's fascinating to me is if we can get in close. I've spoken about this before, about how we perceive the world with our eyes. 85% is our perception, our learning is through our eyes. And in doing all of this, this allows us to watch from a distance, to assess and learn from a distance, to not go in deep. It's interesting, yesterday I was even getting on the elevator and a woman asked me, I have a service dog, and I got on the elevator and she said, I don't want to be rude, but you have some sight, right, in order to use that dog. And this is her assessment from afar because, when I go to school to learn to use the dog has to be on point. The dog has to be good at her game. And so she knows how to go and find a button and knows the button for me to push the button. But I assume that this woman was observing this through her perception. So she automatically came to the assumption that, oh, she must have sight. Otherwise she would not be able to do that. And I asked her, and I responded to her, I said, well, I have very limited sight, but people who are completely blind can do the same thing. And it was a light bulb, and it was, oh, okay, that's wonderful. But my point here is that was perceiving from afar. If she had not asked that question, she would have internalized that particular, she would have come to that conclusion, and that would have been the end of the story for her, that people who use dogs must have some sight. And what I'm saying about being able to get in close is we've got to get past our eyesight and get in close and ask the questions, get in close and sit down with the people. Now, there is, I think we have to be careful of how we begin to, that dialogue with each other, so that we are making sure the other is open and ready to, to engage. But the point being is that the way we get past these racial tensions, these discriminations, is to not only perceive with our eyes, but get in and have the conversation and sit down. And then we begin to step out of ourselves and begin to hear the other person. She learned something that day.
I find it interesting what you're saying, because it's... if you look at the studies on cognitive empathy, the ability to see how other people are feeling, there's, on the one side of the spectrum, we have people with Asperger's or Down syndrome, so people that have a really difficult time figuring out what other people are feeling. And then with people on the other side, which is a recent study where they combined DNA studies with 23andMe and the and cognitive empathy studies from Oxford, from Baron Cohen there. And what they found is that there's a set of genes, and basically let's say the layman's version of this is, if it's all switched on, then you become a super seer. So I have one of those at work for me, and she's amazing. I mean, she knows what you're feeling before you're able to articulate it. Mm-hmm. The other thing I found interesting, if you layer it on top of that, is this Netflix program called Babies. And in that, they talk about our ability to distinguish facial features from as early as 3 months of age. Mm-hmm. But that we only imprint on our primary caregivers around about age 9 months and older. So all of a sudden, the individuals we knew before has now become groups. And so we seem to get stuck in that. The moment we grow up in monocultures, we end up with an inability to see. Mm-hmm. And then we really do need those conversations. So I find it's interesting that you're coming from a sight challenge part, and then the conclusion that you're coming to is in essence the same, that we need to have the conversation. It doesn't matter if you can or cannot see, you need to have the conversation. Mm-hmm. And but also with neuroplasticity, we know that if you have the ability to read other people's faces, it just takes practice to be able to read faces that you're not used to. Mm-hmm. 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 I mean, one thing is I went to China, and I spent just over a week there in some courses at Tsinghua University learning about how to do business in China. And I spent 3 days at the end of it just sitting in Beijing on a park bench and walking around the streets all by myself and just looking at people. Mm-hmm. Before I went like, I can't figure out what these people are feeling. This is weird. And coming from Africa, it was never a problem for me. And here all of a sudden I was struggling. And by the end of 3 days, I could see somebody was probably Han, because they looked like they're more like people from the south. And mm-hmm. Some people look more like people from the north or northwest, sort of more Mongolian. And it's just interesting and fascinating how quickly our bodies and our minds adapt. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What do you think? Do you think leaders should promote relationships at work or connections at work?
I think it's imperative that leaders do that. Right now, what I often see in the workplace is, people focusing on process, and they forget that it takes people to get the job done. And in order to really be effective, you have to connect with them. You have to be able to know the strengths of your team, the strengths of those around you, and draw on them. Because when you're doing that in relationship building, that also brings out that in that person, makes them feel good about themselves, and they produce for you even more. You have to be able to look at your, read your people and learn that, oh, this individual, this is their particular strength. And if I marry that with this individual, and I marry it with this and this other individual, the sky's the limit. I've got a powerful team. Versus I'm all about process, and I need to get it done, and all of you just fall in line, and here's yours, and here's yours. People will do it, but you will not get the same reaction. You won't get the same feedback. You may not even get the same, retention of that individual. They may go somewhere else, because part of, I think, society today, it's not just about, the job or the work. It's about me, my development, who I am in the process. So there's a lot of work out there for leaders today to be able to read their people, to be able to know generationally where they're coming from, racially, socially wise, where are they coming from? And when you can really pull on those strengths, pull on those aspects as individuals, then you really produce an incredible team. So yes, leadership is about relationship building. what you need to produce will always be there. That is going to be there. How well you do it depends on how well you connect with your team, with your people.
Do you think relationships can help us overcome biases?
I think if we continue to, part of overcoming our bias, again, I would go back, is starting with ourselves, understanding our upbringing, where we come from, who we are, and then layering that onto our workplace, our leadership, our, if it's an organization, if it's a corporation, layering that on top of that. Again, that comes from that self-reflection. But relationships, if we dig in deep, if we, for myself, I would say, if someone sits down and talks to me about disability, talks to me about needs, engages, then I do think we overcome our biases. Just like the message that I mentioned earlier about the woman on the elevator that had an assumption based on her visual perception that was blown out of the water once she engaged. And that is the pivotal point. It's interesting, I was thinking, and I've been thinking about this when we're small, and I was, before I went into the law, I was an early childhood teacher. And I remember with the young children, they were preschool age 3 and 4, I would tell them at some point, because hands are busy, I would say, look with your eyes, not with your hands. And what am I teaching them? I'm teaching them that visual perception. And I didn't think about that till years later, that's what I'm teaching them. And that's what we do teach when we go into, an establishment with a young child. Look with your hand, look with your eyes, not with your hands. So we're breaking down that a little bit as well, the types of imprints we put on children when they're younger. And now we're telling people to engage, dig in deep, don't look with your eyes only, listen, ask the question, engage, use your other senses. And it's kind of reversal that we need to engage in. And I think it's imperative, too, that when we're engaging, that we look into that gray space. There is a gray space of understanding that's not me and it's not you. Sometimes when you're talking to someone and you're engaging with them and you're learning about them, they're not always saying, and I think you touched on this when you're trying to understand the gray space. When you sit down with someone, they may not, you have to be able to read between the lines of what's being said to you when you're learning about those around you. And that's an art that takes time to know that what I'm saying, there's something behind what I'm saying when you're engaging with me.
That kind of perception, though, do you think it only comes with time, or is there a practice element to it as well? How do you think? Let me put it in context. Very good friend of mine, Musa, took his kids to school, actually to football practice the other day. And after practice, the kids were playing, sort of like coming off the field together. And Musa's Nigerian, his wife's Dutch, blonde woman. And so his kids don't look like the other kids at school. And the dad of the little boy they were playing with came up to them and said, we don't associate with people like that. And we're talking about children. We're talking about children pre-primary school, primary school level, and it's just like, the pain, it causes me pain to think about it, But it doesn't do that for everyone. And I'm wondering, how do we makes maybe the wrong word. How do we help people to understand the pain and get them to work towards solutions? Because when it's anger, people walk away. People don't necessarily like confrontation. But how can we have a confrontation that turns into a learning conversation?
That's when we have to begin to engage in those difficult conversations. I think that we will have no choice to do so. It's one of those things where time will tell, because if you look at the population in the United States, it's going to be, in the next 30 years, 40 years, it will be minority based. The couple you speak of will be the norm, that it won't be unusual. And there are more and more children in this space. Difficult conversations are arising now. I see it in my church. I see it in my community at large. These conversations are being pushed. The envelope is being pushed. I think we are moving in that direction, whether we like it or not. I can think of all sorts of stories through time. And the young child and the parents that you speak of are going to exist. And when I was a child, and I think I was 10 years old, and there was a young Jewish girl that I thought was my best friend. And one day she said to me, and I never really understood it, but she said, "Oh, I can never come to your house. You're not Jewish. I can never have you over." And I thought, oh, okay. So, these types of things exist. When I was you can fast forward from, 10 years old to when I was an early childhood teacher, and a young little boy was sitting next to me, and it was fascinating to me. He was 3 years old, and I was the only African American teacher there, and I was sitting with him waiting for his father to come, and he was looking at my hand, and I guess all of a sudden this light bulb went off for him, and he started rubbing my hand, and he just said to me in the most innocent voice, he goes, "Why won't that rub off? Your hand is dirty." And I thought, his father, his father was from South Africa, and his father had notions of what he thought his son should be, he thought his son should be exposed to. He was very limited in his exposure. And I looked at him and I said, "Oh, well, that is the color of my skin, and that won't rub off. That's who I am." And the most I could do in that instant is know that he's known me as a teacher. Whatever he may learn in his home, hopefully he will challenge it as an adult. But, at the same time, I have to respect his household as a teacher. But by knowing me, I can only hope he would be grown today. By knowing me, I would only hope that perhaps that seed was planted, that, she's not a bad person after all. As he grows older, he will reflect on that. But honestly, we are moving in that direction. The society is pushing the discussion. The discussion is ripe. It's there. We can't go back.
I think it's this. I mean, we all know horror stories. I think when I was knee-high to a grasshopper, basically, just sort of like first few years in school, I had a little friend on the farm that I grew up in Africa that I played with. And he ran and he fell and he cut open his stomach with a bottle when he fell. And my mum and I rushed him to hospital and he didn't make it eventually. And so it was a tough time for me to lose a friend at that early age. But when I went to school and talked about him, his memory was treated as if it was worthless. And that to me was really the first time where I realized that I may not be thinking the same way as a lot of my peers. And I was lucky in that when I went to university, there was this guy called Orban, and we shared a room in Bloemfontein. And at the time, it was the first year that black students were allowed at the university, at this specific university. And for me to share a room with someone of color was considered not done. But he was the nicest guy in my year. Why would I not share a room with him? He's still one of the nicest people I know, and we're still friends, you know? And so it's sometimes, I find it frustrating to know the conversations can be had, but that so few people are interested in having them. If we look at characteristics, so what I'm trying to get to is, if we look at leaders, and not the leaders of yesteryear, but the leaders of tomorrow, the leaders going forward from now on, let's start in companies, places where leaders can have a direct impact. What kind of leaders do we need? And what should their characteristics be? If we have to pick 3 things about a person and say, well, if you have this, then you have a future in this new world of ours. If you can think of the 3 key characteristics you would say a great leader will have going forward, what would that be?
If I had to start with one, I would choose empathy. You have to have the ability to not be afraid to step out of yourself and to learn about others. It does not mean that you give up who you are, but you have an ability to listen and understand who others are. And that's where I'd say you have to have that ability to navigate that gray space. If I were to choose another quality, I would say that someone who does not have a fear of the unknown. If there's one word, I don't know that there's a word I would think of, but the phrase would say a lack of, no fear of the unknown, because there are so many things that are not clear in terms of relationships. There are so many things that will challenge you in terms of pushing the envelope, in terms of saying, no, that's not right, or how can that be, or I want to know more about that. You have to not have a fear and be able to stand up for yourself. And if I were to choose a third, patience, knowing that change will come, but change requires, patience. It's not overnight. It could be a couple of years, but the ability to know that it is coming, and I will be patient, fearless, and pushing the envelope. I will be one who stays in that gray space and understands myself in relationship to others. but am able to understand and listen to others, to walk the gray space, and to be patient, but fearless. All of those things, I think, are key elements. Because you have to be able, when you're in that gray space, when you're looking and you have that patience, but you're fearless, you know when the time is ripe to move it through. It's a balancing act. It's a combination of all those things. And if you can really exercise being grounded in yourself, being fearless and patient and being empathetic, I think those are key factors in leadership.
To what extent do you think Jimmy Carter lives those ideals?
Oh my gosh. Isn't that funny? I would say that he does live them. He's done Habitat for Humanity. He's done, I think it was it's the diseases in the developing world that he's been able to, bring down to zero or next to zero. It required patience. It required working and navigating among cultures and people and governments, seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, knowing where the beacon is, even though in front of that obstacles were swaying you one way or another. It required empathy to be in the gray space for him to accomplish all of those goals. My gosh, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because that is who he is. That is definitely who he is and his accomplishments. But
I also find it fascinating that you chose him as somebody that you admire. Are these also qualities that you foster yourself?
They are. They really are, and I think as someone with a disability, there can be many frustrations. Even with the woman who stopped me and asked me in the elevator, I could have been offended. But there's a part that you say, this is a question. You need to be patient. You need to answer the question, because that sends that person away with a nugget and knowledge that they can carry forward. So I oftentimes, as I've gotten older, have to exercise that patience. And by gosh, being fearless and in my endeavors is definitely something I need to that I exercise, because if not, then you get knocked down. You got to get back up, and that's part of that fearless. And it's interesting for me, as someone who is female, someone who is African American, and someone who is blind. My greatest challenge is my disability. It's interesting how one might think, race comes into play. Race doesn't require as much patience as disability. Disability, as I mentioned earlier, crosses all spectrums. So it requires greater patience, and there's more acceptance in terms of race and in terms of gender before disability. Or I shouldn't say acceptance, but lack of knowledge.
I think this is just a stab in the dark, but I sometimes feel that when people don't know, the assumptions they make around their discomfort leads them onto tracks where they come to conclusions that are so far off the mark. I mean, as a gay guy growing up in Africa, the assumptions that were made about me, right, were phenomenal, to say the least. But at the same time, I see that happening around me as well. People making assumptions about race, people making assumptions about disability. I mean, people being treated as if they are lesser, be that intellectually or in the other way, and just because they're different. And I wonder how can we bridge that if we're not patient?
If we cannot exercise patience, how do we bridge that? Is that?
Yeah.
There are people who, I guess, that are driven towards getting, the job done, or if you're more knowledge based, then make sure that you have all of if you're inquisitive enough to go and research it, then make sure you gather all of the knowledge that you can about a particular area, about a particular disability. But minus the engagement, you have got to engage. You've got to be able to sit down, take the time to learn about individuals. That just has to be a part of it. I don't think that's a matter of patience. That's a matter of, if you're going to, as my mother would always say, when we were growing up, she exposed us to different cultures, different people, different ways of life, different religions. She said, you need to engage, because if you are going to come up with a certain opinion, you will not do it out of ignorance. You will do it because you have the knowledge, you've been in there, and then you make whatever assumptions you want to make. But it is with knowledge, it's with interaction that you make those assumptions, that you come to your conclusions, not just sitting back and hearing one side of the story. There's always more than one side to the story. And I think if we don't have patience, then we have to be able to challenge our assumptions. If you want to make it scientific, if you're more of someone who's very systematic in your approach, challenge your assumptions. Always challenge your assumptions, so that you keep yourself moving and you don't sit square on one opinion. Challenge it. Make sure it is what you think it is. And challenging it means you have to engage.
I think that was highlighted for me remember way back when we were in class together in Harvard. There was one thing that was said, which I really enjoyed in that specific course. It was the difference between an intent and impact. And that we make these assumptions about what other people may be thinking, and we don't challenge our own perceptions of what we think they're thinking. And so we make statements, we do things, and we hide behind, but it was only a joke, or I didn't mean it that way. And we don't take that ownership of the pain we may be causing or the frustration we may be unleashing on others. And that self-reflection that you're talking about, I think it's just, it has to be there for us to grow as people.
We do often hide behind, our stories that we tell ourselves. When you there's a course called Crucial Conversations, and there's one aspect of it that's mastering your stories. And, we can look at something and we can tell a story. That's where I was talking about earlier, where you're not engaged, you're sitting back and you are seeing and you're coming up with what you perceive is the story. And part of mastering the story is to pose the question, is to get in there and speak on it. And you're right. It's the ability as a leader to be able to say, I was wrong. I misjudged. We need to make it okay and for someone to admit that they were wrong. Oftentimes, when you see when you encountered in mediation, the idea that the end one person just wants to be heard, and the looping back when you're talking to someone, there's a recognition that I hear what you're saying, I understand what you're saying. I'm sorry that happened to you. That was a problem when that happened to you. All of those recognitions that, what the other person is saying is valid. And the recognition that I misjudged, I'm sorry. That's kind of that reconciliation that needs to take place when a difficult conversation comes up, when something arises as a leader. If a leader can't admit when there is something that has gone awry or something has gone in the wrong direction, then you can't make progress. We're not perfect as human beings. We make errors. We have to be able to, the strength of us is also admitting when we misjudged and put ourselves back on course with individuals, because there's such a level of respect that is gained from the other person when they hear that, oh, wow, there's an admission here. This person is not infallible. This person has, some errors that they need to work on. This person is not perfect. There is a respect behind that when you allow yourself to be human and to admit mistakes, learn from mistakes, talk about them, and move forward from them.
I think vulnerability's counterpoint to me in this is forgiveness.
Yes. Yes.
Forgiveness of the other person, but also the forgiveness of self.
And oftentimes that's in leadership, that's a very hard thing, because we're meant to be the one who is infallible, the one that can do it. And when we go, we do something that was an error, that wasn't quite the right path, to admit that, to forgive yourself for that, is very hard to do. Because to make a quote mistake is not a negative word. Mistake is a word that should invoke learning, should invoke reflection, self-reflection, should invoke how to take a different path. Mistake or error is not a negative. It's the process. It's the new process of beginning to learn another way. And I think we have to learn those types of principles, that to err brings about new change and new opportunity. So, yeah.
I think that's interesting you mentioned that, because in research, the whole principle of research and investigation is that you will fail first before you succeed.
Correct.
So the more often you fail, the faster you get to a point where you can succeed. But as humans, we tend to hold leaders to almost an infallible standard. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think if I look at the, I'm going to just say American presidents over the last 20 or 30 years, I think the ones that I admire the most are the ones that could acknowledge mistakes, but also bring that compassion that you were talking about. And they did not persist in a course of action once they discovered that course of action was not beneficial anymore. And it wasn't self-serving only.
When I was reading, when I was studying to meet with President Carter, I was reading his books, and at one point within his presidency, he sat down because it wasn't going as he had initially thought, and he brought people in to talk about and to truly hear what their opinions were, to plot a new course, to change a route. But it really takes a leader being able to say, I need to do a self-assessment. I need to reevaluate where I am and what I'm doing. I need to understand that something isn't right. I know it in my gut, but now I need to admit it and bring it out into the forefront and talk to others about it. I think one of the things that I would add in my admiring of Jimmy Carter was that he brought in others to talk candidly to him. And in that, you establish that next growth that can, emerge out of that. Not to internalize it, because then you get trapped in it, right? I mean, you get trapped in your own mind, in your own process. But in that admission, to reach outward to others, because if you're feeling it, it's probably being seen other places as well. But you have to be able to reach outward as well.
I was thinking, if you think about this compassion, connection, and reaching out to others, and we think about an online world, we've become so much more online in the last year or two. Do you think, or what do you think could be the role for blind people specifically in online mediation, or mediation where sight is not the primary source of information anymore?
What I think would be interesting is, and I don't know that this is just in terms of blindness, but it does invite us to begin to listen, to bring about that other sense that we have, our hearing, to begin to tap into what you were saying when you were sitting and observing people and trying to get into that gray space. You have to begin to listen to the words that are not said. You've got to begin to listen to tone, to hesitation in voice, to a voice rapidly speeding up, saying, maybe illustrating nervousness. You've got to be able to listen. And there are so many cues that we can tap into in that process. When we're face to face, I guess, myself as a mediator, I even face to face, I can't necessarily see them. Although I must say that in my upbringing, people have always said that I have an intuitive nature. So even when I could see, I could still read people. But all of that said, it's just going to bring us into a new age of moving away from our eyes as a primary source and moving into our other senses. Not just blindness, it's everybody. Everyone's going to have to listen more readily. I don't know.
I was wondering if you, just one last question. If we think of this world which is now gone online, I mean, you're sitting in the US and I'm sitting in Amsterdam and we're having this conversation,
Right.
It's, looking at somebody's face in a very small screen and trying to figure out what they're thinking, what they're feeling. In this online world, from a blind perspective, I think you just mentioned some of the stuff that you think that we need to pay attention to. But if you were to give sighted people, or people in general, a tip or two, just to say, next time in a conversation, as a mediator, I mean, you hear stuff. I know you, Cynthia. I know that you pick up between the lines that a lot of other people don't,
Yes.
And if you could give people that are listening just one or two tips on what they can do to make that being in the moment more effective and connected and maybe hear what's between the lines. Do you have a tip or two for people?
In the virtual world, what I can say that what I have found very interesting is that we are locked now into wanting to see that person, that square image on the screen, and all is well. And I think, gosh, one time we could teleconference and we could still get the job done. But Zoom has really continued to kind of perpetuate the visual need to engage with each other. People, the etiquette of having your screen on so you can see the person, even if it's this tiny speck. And unfortunately, we've moved away from the whole idea of calling and teleconferencing where you didn't see the individual and you still engaged. You still had a very productive conversation with a group of people over the telephone line. So as we move into this virtual age and we still hang on to the need to see each other, even if it's a little square image, I would probably ask people to, disengage from what you're seeing and again tap into what you can hear. The whole concept of virtual reality, I think we have to be careful with that. I think it can create another world of vision rather than tapping into our other senses. And I would encourage people to, disengage from the camera and listen. Do things that can help you listen.
But let me put it this way. It sounds like you're saying, close your eyes for a minute and listen. And if we were to do that, if I were to close my eyes and just listen to a person in a conversation or a person, in essence, where I'm sitting in a meeting and it's almost like eavesdropping, in a way, what kind of things, or maybe there's one thing you would say, is it that we should listen for? Something that can help us connect, something that help us be in the moment and feel what the other person is feeling.
I guess I would fall back on the mediation techniques, and I would say, if I'm telling you a story, if I am talking about work, relationships, whatever it may be, I would say to listen for what is not being said. The tone of voice, the story, where is it leading the individual? What are they trying to say to you? So oftentimes, a voice that's happy, you can obviously say, you're feeling very good about what's going on around you. A voice that's sad may not, or a voice that's slow and low may speak to you. So someone may speak to you, but hidden behind that, you understand why the voice is low. I would encourage people to think of why the voice is happy, why the voice is low, why the voice is a certain way. Engage from that point of view. That's kind of getting into the gray space. And from there, I think that you can engage more closely with the individual. We don't often say what we want to say. We go around about and we're indirect in our conversations. Sometimes we're right on point, and sometimes, someone will be able to say, "Oh, I hear what you're saying." But even in that, even in some of those direct statements, stop for a moment and say to yourself, why is that being said like that? What is that person saying there? Those are the types of questions that we need to ask to fully engage with each other. especially in difficult conversations, especially when we're dealing around disability, race, society, cultural, gender. No one, we're working on how to communicate with each other. We're working on that. So we go roundabout when we talk about what we want to, the point we're making. So I would encourage people to listen for the what, the why behind the words that are being said and engage from there.
I think that's quite powerful. It's also something that Chris Voss talks about. When you recognize what somebody's saying, he talks about paraphrasing and summary and all the stuff that we normally have in active listening. But one of the things that he mentions as well, and that is label the emotion. But it also means to be able to label the emotion, you must be able to hear it. And it sounds to me like you're saying, listen with compassion and listen for the emotion, listen for the feeling, listen for, as I said, what is not being said. The underlying power of who we are in the relationships and connection instead of just the words.
And that, Epstein, is the bridge.
I have to agree. That connection is something that makes it more than just people being in a room together. Even if it's virtual. Well, Cynthia, I would like to thank you for coming for having this conversation with me today. It's always lovely to talk to you, and today has been no exception.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed myself. You're always a pleasure.
And I hope you survive.
I will. Thank you.
So I wish you a lovely day and a wonderful week.
You too as well.
And I hope to speak to you again soon.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
That was Cynthia Bryant. What I find fascinating is the way her mother deliberately exposed her to a wide range of cultures whilst growing up. It's caused her to see empathy as an essential quality in a leader, especially as she's talked about the difficulties of segregation. I know I've cast my net quite wide over my lifetime, but don't we all sometimes miss something? Shouldn't we cast it just that little bit wider? Now go out there, be exponential, and do something nice for someone else. You can find us on the web by going to podcast.exponentially.me. We will also find additional media resources and some amazing insights.